Hello everyone, I'm Padmini Arhant, author and presenter padminiarhant.com as well as prakriti.padminiarhant.com. I welcome you all to the topic United Nations Security Council Dissolution. This topic is extremely important. As you can realize, the United Nations Security Council as a subset to United Nations organization, the international body, is responsible for decision making in terms of resolving international affairs. United Nations Security Council was formed in the past century following the World War II. This is soon after the formation and founding of United Nations as an international body. The five members, United States, Britain, France, Russia, and China, became the permanent members of the UN Security Council, that is the subset, the body within United Nations organization. These five members, in possession of veto power since the past century, that is the 20th century, up until now, have been involved in making decisions on international matter. The United Nations Security Council was structured or restructured with two tiers. That is, the first tier comprising the five permanent members with veto power, as I just mentioned, and the second tier comprising the members of United Nations, but they are on a temporary status. That is, the UNSC five members and the second tier included, becoming the 15 members representing the United Nations Security Council, with the remaining 10 of the 15, of which, as I said, 5 members are permanent members. The remaining 10 members are temporary members for a period of 2 years, and they function on a revolving basis. That is, it is rotated, allowing other members of the United Nations to be part of this temporary membership. But again, not all of them seem to be eligible, as this is again subject to the 5 members' discretion in choosing the second tier members in the decision-making process. So, United Nations Security Council, having been restructured, as I just explained, with 15 members, even though the 5 members are the key and the core members of the UNSC, and they are responsible for making any decisions, especially in authorizing economic sanctions as well as military interventions, as these two functions have been the core activities for UN Security Council. UN Security Council has also been, they have also been involved in isolating, choosing, and of course for forging alliance with nations that they regard as allies versus adversaries. So those whom they consider to be their partners, their allies, of course, there has always been favors extended to them, and at the same time, those who have been identified by members of the core members of the UN Security Council, especially United States, Britain, France, the three nations, the three members in particular have preferences in terms of their allies and adversaries, and they have acted accordingly up until now. The other two members, Russia and China, have also been referenced in this regard for having taken sides, so to speak, on international matters such as the Syrian conflict or Iran nuclear deal and so on. But then when we really focus on the five members and their background, such as their legacy, that really deserves attention. Five members, United States, France, Britain, Russia and China, every one of them have their own fair share of a legacy that involves imperialistic quest, invasion, occupation, territorial annexations, not barring human rights violations as well. The reason I am highlighting about these characteristics is because when these members convene in a meeting and convene a meeting and they authorize economic sanctions, which is one of the key activity of United Nations Security Council ever since its formation up until now, more so in the past decades, with severe economic sanctions that has been imposed on nations they do not agree with, or the nations and the governments they deem not in compliance with their requirements and demands, which of course ironically do not seem to apply on them. That is something that I'm going to highlight in this segment. As I just mentioned, there are five members with such profile like territorial quest, invasion, occupation of foreign land. They have been involved in conflicts as well, and even as I speak, they are engaged in conflict in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, in even in the Baltics. There are skirmishes that cannot be discounted, and then of course the Korean Peninsula, which is now in the process of peaceful negotiations, and I really hope that the peaceful negotiations would evolve into a permanent peace treaty, which I talked about in my previous presentation when I discussed on Korean Peace Summit. Now, with UN Security Council members, the five of them having played a dominant role since inception, since UNSC inception up until now, and even though the whole idea of restructuring United Nations Security Council with the explanation that 5 membership is now extended to 15 membership, while retaining the veto power, which is the concentration of power entirely among the 5 members, is definitely a controversy. The reason I say this is, any organizations, institutions that are formed in at a time that was a different period, and in this case it was in the past century, 20th century, post World War II. And now that we are in the 21st century, and that too, the second half of the 21st century, with almost more than nearly 2 decades gone by in the 21st century, and an organization such as United Nations Security Council not having transformed or not having evolved in recognition of the changing and the prevalent, the present geopolitical landscape and economic paradigm is something that deserves and merits discussion and debate, and that is what I'm here to talk about. For I believe United Nations Security Council has not really served the purpose as it claimed to be, or the core values that are expected from an international body has not been demonstrated by this body, by United Nations Security Council, predominantly due to the personal preferences with isolations of nations and arbitrary and consistent action in terms of economic sanction, which I believe in itself is a human right violation. Economic sanctions in the first place are enforced or imposed on nations for their alleging their human rights violations as the main reason. But then in doing so, United Nations Security Council themselves are engaged in human rights violation. That is something that ought to be acknowledged by them. When economic sanctions are imposed, they are there is an impact on the entire population of that country. Whatever the reasons are, whether, as I said, human rights violation is the predominant reason that has always been cited behind economic sanctions. But then, can anyone possibly deny that there is no human rights violation in their respective states, especially the 5 members at the UN Security Council? Can they possibly say that there has never ever been human rights violation in their domain on their part? I mean, that would be something really interesting if the response happens to be negative. For I, as well as all of you who are listening to this presentation, very well know that human rights violation is a commonality in the world, and this is something that has been going on for a long time. I guess we can even go back to the evolutionary period up until now. This is something that has been happening, and that demands a serious commitment from humanity, that is especially those who are reigning control over humanity and humanitarian affairs and system, the authorities, those who are in control of the global system. They are the ones who are responsible for human rights violations and the immense suffering experienced by people worldwide. And we can go back to the colonization days, and of course the colonization still persists. That is something that has not ceased. with invasion and occupation of foreign land and territories, denying the people of those states and regions their fundamental right to statehood, to liberty and freedom, having occupied their land and their nations for decades, denying those people their basic rights, their inalienable right to freedom, to liberty and independence. So I'm not really sure when United Nations Security Council is citing, especially the 5 members, when they convene meetings, and the immediate outcome of such meeting has always been, this is invariable decision, and that is economic sanctions against nations they identify as violators. That is, they are in violation of human rights, and of course there are also other reasons that accompany such decision, and that being the nuclear ambitions or nuclear aspirations. That is another topic that I do wish to talk about, and I think I already did, yes, in my previous segment, the topic denuclearization, that is nuclear disarmament, is a topic that I presented in my previous presentation. I will continue to talk about that matter, for that is something that deserves constant attention and immediate action as well. So when I talk about United Nations Security Council activities, the core actions that are repeatedly taken by the members of the UN Security Council is, as I said, imposing economic sanctions. So when they cite human rights violations, nuclear aspirations, and then there are political system is also targeted as quoting that the political systems of certain nations are not, I quote, democratic, and so on. But then, these reasons really do not have much legitimacy. The reason I say this is because the nations who are the core members, that is the 5 core members at the UN Security Council, they have to really pay attention to their own system, their own issues in their domain, in their own state. Is there not any human rights violation in their own country? Is their political system entirely democratic, as they would claim? And the other thing is, what about the nuclear status? They are comfortably and without any remorse or regrets, they engage in this persistent nuclear proliferation, nuclear testing. Their nuclear aspirations are extraordinary. As a matter of fact, even they expand their nuclear ambitions by allocating enormous amount towards nuclear status. So all of that really has to be accounted for, and that has to be acknowledged and recognized by these members, which they have not done. And for them to engage in a meeting that claiming that the reasons for their economic sanctions against any nation, whether it be North Korea, Cuba has been sanctioned for decades, so this is like going back to the Cuban Revolution. Up until now, Cuba is still under sanctions, and Cuba, I would say, is one nation that has been targeted for the political system. There is also human rights violations that are being suggested. Again, these are all these alleged human rights violations, and then the political system, citing the political system of Cuba being a communist nation. And this is where I find the irony, and the irony is so prominent that cannot possibly escape anyone's attention. Anyone who is observant, even otherwise, I don't think this can possibly escape anyone's mind when we talk about communism. China, as I mentioned in my last segment, China by no means is a democratic system. I mean, I hope that is realized, that China is a permanent member of UN Security Council with veto power, and China enjoys all the privileges. A member of International Trade Organization, that is ITO, and China is granted the most favored nation status by United States, who condemn other nations for their political system not being democratic and so on. But then, they seem to have no problems in having these cordial relations, maintaining normal relations with a nation such as China, knowing well that China is an economic power, it has the economic capabilities that has been demonstrated in the past 2 decades, if not going further back. But then, especially in the last couple of decades, China's economic growth has been extremely beneficial to the regions, and of course, when it comes to international trade activities as well, even though there are difference of opinion when it comes to dealing on an economic basis with allegations against China on currency adjustments, and of course the recent discussions or arguments that exist between the incumbent administration in the United States and China, citing tariffs, import tariffs, and so on. So there are disagreements that exist, and that has been going on with every administration in the United States against China. But nonetheless, China has been an active trading partner with both Europe and United States, and that goes for the members, the member nations in North America, so I don't think China has been isolated. China has not had any sanctions imposed against for their political system, knowing well that China's political system is by no means democratic, and at the same time, when the UN Security Council, this is the irony is China included as the key member of the UN Security Council, enforcing or imposing economic sanctions against other nations such as North Korea or Cuba and several others who have been targeted for either the political system. As I said, communism has been one of the reasons that has been cited regularly, and then insisting that the political system need to transform into a democracy. But then, when we really want to talk about democracy, that in itself becomes a topic for another day, which I will definitely cover in my presentation. That will be one of the topics that I will discuss and talk about in the coming in the near future. For now, I want to focus on United Nations Security Council reasons behind these excruciating economic sanctions that they seem to justify, even though I firmly believe these economic sanctions are completely unjustifiable. Again, if they want to send a message to the governments, the authorities of those states and nations whom they routinely refer to them as, I quote, rogue regimes, rogue states, end quote. Such references itself is very controversial, and not to mention not necessarily civil either. So the language itself, the tone of language, the references when they talk about other nations, forgetting that these nations, regardless of their political systems and authorities in power, these nations are sovereign nations, and the people of those nations deserve respect. So in references, when they make such references in media and political discourse, you would have noticed that such references are completely unnecessary, and that also in a way creates unpleasantness, and there is also this the distance that is that emerges as a result of lack of respect and courtesy to the people of those nations. Now when we discuss about international affairs in general, United Nations Security Council has miserably failed in resolving international crises. I can cite many, but the prominent ones that deserve attention are the Palestinian crisis, the Middle East peace process. The Middle East peace process, now it goes back to 7 decades. So since the formation of this UN Security Council, and then when the State of Israel was formed on Palestine, and then Israel's military intervention in the neighboring states in the Middle East, the 1967 warfare, and evolving into Israel's occupation and extension of Israeli intervention in not only in Palestine, but also, as I said, in Lebanon and Syria, and that has caused enormous tensions, and that continues until today. Even the Syrian conflict today is a result of the same imperial quest, because this could only be translated as imperial quest. When any state is imposing their military prowess and military activities, extending that across the border for territorial annexations and occupation, that does become an imperial quest and colonization. And that is why I say that this persists even today, and this is the reason for the international crisis in the Middle East and that goes for other regions as well. Then in directing our attention on Syrian conflict, I would say that the occupation of Golan Heights by the State of Israel since the 1967 invasion by Israel, and then of course the occupation of Palestinian territories, West Bank, Gaza, that has become a fortress, so to speak, because Gaza has never been able to function, even though the people in Gaza have had to choose Hamas, that Israel views as, I quote, a terrorist organization. But then, the people in Gaza have also been, in a way, they have had to deal with this permanent sanctions, that is unilateral sanctions by Israeli authorities against the people in Gaza. So, and United Nations Security Council, even though there has been some resolutions passed in this regard, in a way letting the Israeli authorities know that the settlement activities, especially the settlement activities in West Bank on Palestinian territory, that has been a major issue and a controversy that remains unresolved, and again much to international communities disappointment and frustration. The settlement activities continues relentlessly. In fact, with Israeli authorities inviting residents from even other parts of the world, that is whom they consider as part of their society. They have been provided incentives. They have been incentivized to occupy the Palestinian territory, that is the West Bank, through illegal settlement activity. So again, I realized that United Nations Security Council, the resolutions were passed, but then did it have any impact or effect on the issue? Not at all. That's simply because United States, as the core member of the UN Security Council, and often the other members such as Britain have also participated with the veto power, in exercising their veto power and rejecting any resolutions, any effective resolutions that are passed, whether in disagreement of Israeli authorities' illegal settlement activity in West Bank, or the permanent the sanctions, Israeli authorities' sanctions, which of course is unilateral sanctions imposed by them against the people in Gaza, that has been so crippling for the people in Gaza that it has had severe and serious impact, humanitarian impact, that is problems that has exacerbated. It has made the humanitarian problems extreme for the people in Gaza, the Gazans, who have been forced to choose the authorities that are in governance in Gaza. So I would say, even though Hamas is considered by Israeli authorities and anybody else as a terrorist organization, but then have they really given any choice to the people in Gaza, with the unilateral sanctions against the Gazans, and with no other options that are available? They have been in permanent they have been confined to the portion of the Palestinian territory, that they've really not, and they've really not had much choice. And at the same time, any exit from from Gaza under these extreme and severe conditions, with no basic facilities, with no opportunity, they have been completely deprived and denied of normal existence with these sanctions by Israel. When the people in Gaza were trying to seek some other opportunity by trying to leave the confinement, that is the Gazan territory, via Egypt, that is using the pass, the channel that connects with Egypt. That has also been that has also been blocked by Egyptian authorities on their part. So, when you really come to think of it, the people in Gaza and West Bank, and of course Al-Quds, that is the East Jerusalem, is another big controversy, and it's that absolutely deserves attention. I mean, overall, when we really come to think of it, the Palestinian issue has never been considered, utmost important in terms of reaching a final decision. It's simply because, as I said, I'm not saying that the administrations have not tried. Every US administration that has come to power who have attempted to resolve this crisis, and that goes for the Oslo peace treaty or peace process that was attempted from Europe. Whether the Oslo peace accord or any peace process attempted by US administrations, Democrat and Republican alike, that has never materialized, simply because of the reservations that US negotiating members or team have had. That is, they've always had to oblige Israel, being the ally, United States ally, and considered the inseparable, closest ally, that kind of relation that is forged with Israel. So anyone who has tried to resolve the Palestinian crisis have really not been able to achieve much. For any time they bring about the proposal for peaceful resolution of the Palestinian crisis, the settlement activity continues, and then there are other issues about the Al-Quds, that's East Jerusalem, that has also been in a way deployment of troops in Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is considered the second most sacred place of worship for the people of Islamic faith. And so, there are always these very controversial actions that are that takes place, again, on the part of Israeli authorities in particular, and of course there is reaction and retaliation as well from Hamas representing Gaza, and then any easing of the troop presence, Israeli authority deployed presence in Palestinian territory in general, whether it be West Bank or East Jerusalem. The back and forth back and forth exchanges that is often been violent as well. So these problems continue to exist, and the international community are definitely anxious, and they are eager to resolve this crisis for sure. But then the United Nations Security Council, as the body stated as the authority to resolve and address international crisis, has been unsuccessful, and at the same time has not been really very helpful, to say the least. So as I said, with United States exercising the veto power at its disposal whenever there has been an attempt to resolve the Palestinian Palestinian crisis, has been an impediment, to start with. So that is something that cannot be ignored any longer. Every time the UN Security Council comes up with a resolution to convey the message, and at the same time the objection to settlement activities. The settlement activity, I would say, has attracted worldwide condemnation. There could be no denial in this regard. Worldwide condemnation towards the settlement activities that continues unabated until today. So when you're speaking about crisis resolution, I would say that the victims in these situations, in this instance, the Palestinians who are obviously seeking the international body to meet their expectations in terms of their statehood, Palestinian statehood, their civil liberties, the unilateral sanctions that are arbitrarily imposed by the State of Israel against the people in Gaza, and then the deployment, as I said, the Israeli Defense Force presence in Palestinian territory, by and large, almost occupying all of Palestinian territory, restricting civilians' movement and their normal existence. All of that, adds up to the tension and the failure of any peace process. United Nations Security Council, as a body that was initially set up as the only authority stated to be legitimate in addressing these problems and making recommendations and trying to resolve international crisis, has really not done what they were expected to do. As I just said, any resolutions or any proposals that are made to ease tensions and make a breakthrough in this particular issue, that is the Middle East peace process, has been consistently vetoed by United States, and often and at times by other partner Britain, and I would say occasionally France as well. But then with this veto power as an ammunition, it has not really helped in resolving any crisis. As a matter of fact, the veto power has only empowered the core members in choosing sides and in terms of procrastination, not allowing any possible, positive outcome in terms of resolution, such as this Palestinian issue, and that goes for other, crises as well. But then, veto power has been used not for the benefit of humanity, but entirely for political reasons. That is how it has been, exercised up until now. So, as I just said, the UN Security Council with 5 members as the core members representing the decision-making body, even though, as I said, the other 10 members in a revolving status, that is every 2 years, other members of the United Nations are allowed to participate, even though they really do not have much say in the matter, since those members are hamstrung, or they are also incentivized or politically swayed when any key decisions are to be made by UN Security Council. I don't think this is something that should come as a surprise. For this is a fact, and this is this has been prevalent for a long time, and there appears this is all kind of also has in a way become the tradition. And when we try to discuss about UN Security Council role, as I just said, this is just been more channeled in isolating nations, depriving population of normal existence, and of course there are also military interventions that has been authorized to suit the core members, that is one of the core members or the others as well, their imperial motives, such as France intervention in West Africa, in 2015, 2014, when France introduced resolution for military intervention in Mali, for example. Really, these are the issues that has been consistently used for either their own political reasons, their own imperial aspirations, and then anyone that are regarded adversaries, they have always been isolated and treated differently compared to those who equally deserved, if not deserved, something that the UN Security Council members have routinely applied to other states on human rights violations or political system, or as I said, nuclear ambitions and so forth, so on. So what I really want to say about UN Security Council is the UN Security Council has not really performed to the level or demonstrated fairness to begin with. There has been no such thing as fairness. As I said, if there were to be fairness, and if there were to be unbiased, non-partisan decision making, then I would say anything they have done would have first applied to them. political systems or human rights violations or nuclear, status, all of that, would have appropriately applied to them, right? And then they would have, also considered whoever they regard as allies who have been consistently engaged in such activities as well. So, in terms of illegal occupation of foreign land, and at the same time, all the conflicts and confrontations that exist worldwide, who are involved in it, they are the ones who are involved either directly or indirectly, and if not, they are fomenting crisis in some or other part of the world. And so there is no such thing as a peace that is expected to be experienced by the people in different regions, especially the ones who are deemed to be in persistent turmoil, whether that be Middle East with the Syrian conflict. How come the Syrian conflict cannot be brought to an end? This has been it began in 2011 and now 2018, and it's 7 years up. 7 years of warfare, and Syria, the people in Syria have been imposed with economic sanctions, and they've been dealing with terrorism, that is terrorism sponsored by the states. And who are all the states who have been behind the terror sponsorship? None other than the same members who are at this Security Council as permanent members, such as United States, Britain, France, and that goes for EU, even though they are not represented as permanent member, even though Germany is included in the P5+1 as a de facto member. So P5+1 de facto member Germany as the dominant and prominent member of EU. What did they do? With EU decision, EU in fact at the beginning of or the onset of Syrian conflict, EU, instead of extending the ban on weapons supplied to terror networks, EU went ahead and lifted the ban. They ended the arms embargo that was initially in place against the terror networks deployed in Syria. This was at the onset of the Syrian conflict. So what was EU's action? EU, instead of extending the arms embargo, the ban against the terror groups, the terror networks, EU went ahead and lifted the ban, which means, there was no restriction, there was no deterrence in the weapons cache reaching the terror outfits in Syria that were deployed by the same members who are, crying foul on human rights violation, and they are talking about, the political system not being, I quote, democratic, and at the same time, there is also, issues about, as I said, nuclear ambitions among states that they consider are, again, I quote, reckless compared to them, and they claim themselves to be responsible. So, these issues are extremely political to begin with. As I just said, that whenever the political factor overrides humanitarian concerns, and of course there is also legitimacy when we really speak about rights and freedom and democracy and so on. And so I would say, for not having resolved the Palestinian crisis to begin with, since it's, like as I said, it's 7 decades old, and any resolutions that were attempted to diffuse the crisis has all been rejected or ignored by the State of Israel, and again, Palestinian people, the citizens of Palestinian territory, have also been denied even, the membership to become part of the international body, which is the United Nations. When you have a body such as United Nations, and it's considered and declared an international body, and then you are you have these preferences and prejudice against nations worldwide, then I'm not sure how that organization or international organization could possibly be considered or regarded international. When you say international, it has to become, worldwide, and it has to be inclusive. It has to be comprehensive, and it has to be it has to accept all nations, regardless of their size, their political, economic, military status. So, without any discrimination, without any reservations, those nations worldwide, every nation, small and big, as I said, in every part of the world, should have the right to be the member of an organization. Only then that such organization could be legitimately regarded and considered international, global body. When you become very selective, and you only offer membership to nations, even though you claim that majority of nations in the world are members of the United Nations, but again, there are some nations that are barred from becoming a member at one of the core members of the UN Security Council, like United States ally, Israel's behest. Then such international, such organization do not qualify as international. We have to apply the definition appropriately, right? Otherwise, it becomes meaningless. So this is why I say that UN Security Council has not been able to play an effective role in all these issues and matter, and that is something that deserves consideration and contemplation. And my decision in calling for United Nations Security Council dissolution is primarily premised on the lack of credibility, legitimacy, and the preferences and partisanship that has been persistent within the body. And I would say that is the reason the UN Security Council really do not qualify to be the decision-making body for reasons I just cited. I know that I have more to discuss, and I will enumerate them in my segment, in my next segment, which is going to be the subsequent segment to this topic. on United Nations Security Council, why I urge and I strongly feel about UN Security Council dissolution. Like as I said, they have not really met the requirements as a able, efficient decision-making body in resolving international disputes, crises. On the contrary, they have fostered, fomented, and in many instances, they have been behind and responsible for warfare, conflicts, and citizens, that is the most nations, populations, economic and humanitarian plight. That is also created issues like refugee crisis, humanitarian disasters, health problems, and then starvation through economic sanctions. And these matter cannot be slighted as something that was necessary. I mean, this is again, it's unthinkable that some members at the UN Security Council somehow believe that, their action, that is the United Nations Security Council imposed economic sanction is necessary, and they strongly believe, and they have this strong conviction that the sanctions alone can bring about the results that they are expecting from any nation with respect to whatever they are citing as reasons. Like as I said, human rights violation, or change in governments, or nuclear intentions. Any of that. I would say, when they have been systematically in violation in every respect, that is the members of the Security Council, they have been in violation in every respect. And then when they discuss about those nations whom they regard are not in compliance, that they are not obliging their demands, that of course creates a serious credibility factor. And again, not ending the Syrian conflict when there was no need to fuel the conflict in the first place. The Syrian warfare was completely brought upon for imperial motives, imperial ambitions. I talked about it in my previous segment when I presented the topic on Syrian warfare with the United States strikes, air strikes recently that was authorized by this administration under President Donald Trump, again following the pattern by the predecessors. But again, the Syrian conflict has not been brought to an end. On the contrary, there appears to be no desire to end the conflict, and then ignoring the humanitarian problems experienced by the people in Syria. As I said, Syria has been imposed with economic sanctions long before, and then combined with the terror sponsorship by these members such as United States, Britain, France, and their allies in the Middle East. And then you have the humanitarian problems arising as a result of these two actions alone. Economic sanctions imposed against Syria and the terror sponsorship. These two actions have evolved into a major humanitarian disaster for that state and for the people of that state. So, again, if we were to direct our focus to every region and part of the world, what we would ascertain is that the members of the Security Council have miserably failed in resolving the crisis. On the contrary, their own involvement, indulgence has only made the matters worse, and their lack of initiatives to ease and alleviate tensions has been another contributing factor. So these issues obviously, humanity is confronted with a dilemma, that is, those who are at the helm as the members of a decision-making body, when they are in gross violation in every respect, I think the existence or the continuation of such body is meaningless, and it does not really serve the purpose as it is intended to be, or at least it was projected to do so. But then this topic is not going to end here. As I said, I have more to contribute in terms of why UNSC dissolution is important, is critical. Dissolving UN Security Council is imperative, and one might ask, what next? Then my response to that is there has to be an international body. United Nations as an international body has to encompass the entire world. There cannot be this pick and choose and the selective process and heeding to any particular nation's demand to exclude some states and then to discount or ignore their own violations and endless occupation, illegal occupation and invasion and occupation of foreign land and so on. So there has to be United Nations as an organization need to evolve in becoming a legitimate, effective global body to preside over international crisis. But then every nation, regardless of their size, their economic, political, and as I said, military power, they have to be accepted based on their sovereign status. That is, as sovereign nations, they should be allowed to exercise their right, and as a member of an international body, allowing them to exercise their vote on international affairs. When these nations are going to be representing their own people in an international body, I think every nation on earth, that is in this entire world, should be able to demonstrate that when it comes to resolving international crisis. So every nation has a say on the matter, as opposed to just 5 exclusive members, which in itself is a unipolar body, even though they seem to have objection to the concept of unipolar system. Again, I said, there is so much, there are ironies in everything that they say and do. Somehow they don't seem to be cognizant of their functionality and their profile, which I find quite intriguing, to say the least. So what I would like to emphasize is that United Nations Security Council dissolution is no longer an option, it is a necessity. This body cannot continue as it is. As I said, it has lost its meaning, it has lost its legitimacy, credibility and purpose. for several reasons. I mean, I have quoted some of them, just like couple itself I know may not be sufficient, but then there are many which I will cover in my next segment as a subsequent to this topic in my segment 2 on this topic. But for now, as I said, I think I made it very clear why I strongly and firmly believe that UN Security Council cannot function or has never been able to prove its efficiency, its efficacy, ethical efficacy as well, with the members at the UN Security Council, especially in position of veto power, exercising to suit their political situation, as well as their preferences towards their allies, or hostility towards anyone they do not agree with or accept them as a sovereign nation. So and I feel that United Nations, following UNSC dissolution once and for all, accepting every nation in the world as a sovereign nation worthy of respect, and allowing every nation to participate in exercising their sovereign right, and voicing their concerns and contributing towards a resolution of international crisis is the way forward. And that way, every nation would have the opportunity, without being pressurized, without being forced into decision making that they are not comfortable with, or that do not resonate with their population back home. But yet, the representatives who are, as I said, in a meeting, or often they are hamstrung, or they are coerced into a decision that the people of those nations are not in agreement with. So that is why I feel that United Nations Security Council is to be dissolved, and UN as an organization now expanding with more members. That is, I believe now there are about 186 nations that are members of the United Nations. I'm sure any others who are still under occupation, who are denied sovereign status, whether it be Palestine or Tibet, and other nations that are obviously seeking independence, they all have to be admitted as well, so that they can represent their population and experience the sovereign right that they possess, and so they can interact with the international members in a forum, in a body such as a global body. If the United Nations organization happens to be the forum, provided UN meets the requirement, and that is absolutely necessary, that they cannot be including or excluding members at will, or at anyone's behest and recommendations or objection. So it has to be non-partisan. It has to extend membership to all nations in the world, without any restriction in terms of the membership, and then allow every nation to participate through General Assembly. So the General Assembly becomes the decision-making body on international affairs by exercising the vote on behalf of the population, and and express their views and concerns and their the their support or objection, however it might be, on international matter. So for now, I'm going to end this topic here, and as I said, I'm going to further highlight on more reasons behind UNSC dissolution in the next segment. I am Padmini Arhant, author and presenter, padminiarhant.com, as well as prakriti.padminiarhant.com, representative, espouse in divine mission, representing Almighty God in spirit, soul and flesh, as significant other, the other half, and I cannot emphasize that the opportunity to make these presentations and discuss about events, global events and humanitarian affairs is indeed a wonderful opportunity as far as I'm concerned, and I'm extremely humbled, and at the same time I try to express my views as well as the issues with clarity, accompanied by facts, not fabrication. I thank you all for your interest and attention, and I will be back soon with the segment 2 on UNSC dissolution.